Hello, everyone. It's great to have you back. It's a fantastic Sunday afternoon. I just got back from playing indoor soccer intramural match where we won 9 goals to 5. And I just walked back here. Later today, I'm gonna do some reading in preparation for my discussion class. It's the beginning of the winter quarter here at the University of Chicago. We just finished up the first week, and then tomorrow we'll begin the start of the second week. I'll be doing some reading for my discussion class tomorrow, and then I'll also be doing some other readings. It's been about 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, since we last talked. And in that time, I've been doing a lot of reading, a lot of studying, and a lot of thinking about how I want to approach politics, what vision I have for the future. And one of the things that I've really mulled about is how do you deal with intra-party conflict? How do you deal with intra-party conflict both on a cultural level, in terms of the different styles in which we engage with politics, whether it's something that's primarily through social justice or something that's primarily through economic, or whether it's something more populist or more technocratic. And then also differences in real actual policy between whether we do something that's more a more like FDR, more big government style of economic governance, or should we do something that's a little bit more austerity focused, something that's perhaps a little bit less fun to talk about or engage with at first glance, but what might be more conducive to long-term success. I've been thinking about how we navigate this kind of things. I'm a Democrat, but I am much more fond of the third way form of the democratic governance. I really am fond of Bill Clinton's presidency. I think he did a fantastic job. I really like Barack Obama's presidency, but a large reason why I like Barack Obama, just in addition to his fantastic character, his eloquence, the way that he carries himself, is that he very much operated under a market-oriented direction. When you look at the ACA, Dodd-Frank, the Simpson-Bowles deficit reduction plan, where he was willing to address some spending in Social Security. This was back in 2010. Between the ACA, Dodd-Frank, Simpson-Bowles, and then the TPP, he very much operated under a more market-oriented, business-friendly, direct style of governance, a more business-friendly framework than you would certainly ever expect from a left-wing party. And this is actually what separates Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. What makes them very unusual as presidents of left-wing parties is that they are unusually willing to operate in a more market-friendly direction. And those are my beliefs. That's how I believe the economy should be run. The kind of more progressive economics doesn't super resonate with me because I don't think that it is long-term sustainable, particularly when it comes to deficit spending, as well as the fact that a lot of these policies, you think about stuff like price controls through rent control or capping credit card interest rates. You look at the wealth tax, or you look at single-payer healthcare, they don't adequately engage with some of the secondary effects that can have really downstream negative effects on economic growth, on businesses, and even have negative effects on the very people that they're trying to help. So I've always been more in favor of the, perhaps you can say, more neoliberal, more third way form of economic governance. Now, I want to talk about how you deal with navigating intra-party conflict. The Democratic Party has pretty historically, especially since Bernie Sanders came onto the scene, has had a little bit more of a moderate wing and a progressive wing. Increasingly, it seems that the progressive wing is winning out, especially in terms of economics. When I look at a lot of the ads, they're very much more operating under that rich versus poor zero-sum mindset and that framework. And you look at the Republican Party, they have their own insurgency. Now, traditionally, you look at the Republican Party that went from Reagan extending all the way until, I would say, Mitt Romney. And it was that same market fiscally conservative was the fiscally conservative and like family values. You can maybe say family values plus fiscal conservative. I would say religious values plus fiscal conservatism was the bedrock of it. It was a little bit more mild mannered. John McCain, Mitt Romney, and then Trump comes onto the scene, and he, in many respects, first of all, with his economic views, heavily populist views, but also his bravado, he just shoos that all away. But now, and Trumpism has dominated the Republican Party for 9 years now, but now it's not even just Trumpism. There is a new brand of politics that even extends beyond that. And people are now starting to increasingly become aware of it. It's called Groyperism. It's heavily racial. It's a very racial centric worldview. It's one that takes an almost existential view of immigration, and not to mention some very perhaps controversial views on women, various types of browns, various types of religion, Muslims, Hindus, and especially Jews. That takes a controversial view on and various types of Christianity as well, and it's a particularly polarizing worldview, and that's putting it a little diplomatically. And one person who's been especially on the negative end of Groyperism so far as we head into the 2026 election cycle is Vivek Ramaswamy. Vivek Ramaswamy, he's running for governor in Ohio. I have quite a bit of disagreements with Vivek Ramaswamy, particularly on cultural issues, or probably some economic issues as well. But Vivek Ramaswamy is a little bit separate from the traditional MAGA base in that he definitely does seem to be a little bit more interested in the actual governance aspect of politics. He cares more about that, like kind of more traditional free market economics, more Reaganism. You could even say that he on many social issues, he's just not really all that interested in MAGAism, that culture warrior stuff. I remember earlier he was even willing to say, like, I'm totally fine with gay marriage. And then just recently, in the context of this story that I'm about to read to you, he said that a huge rebuke of Groyperism. He said that what matters isn't the color of your skin, it's the content of your character. But that's becoming increasingly a big dividing point in the Republican Party. So I'm going to read to you a guest essay by Vivek Ramaswamy. This wasn't posted all that super recently, but it's an important thing that I want to talk about. It says, Groyperism isn't conservatism, it's anti-Americanism. This was written on December 17th, 2025, and I think that it will be something that's an interesting topic of debate. By Vivek Ramaswamy. There are two competing visions now emerging on the American right, and they are incompatible. One vision of American identity is based on lineage, blood and soil, inherited attributes matter most. The purest form of an American is a so-called heritage American, one whose ancestry traces back to the founding of the United States or earlier. This view is now popularized by the Groyper right, a rapidly ascended online movement that argues for the creation of a white-centric identity. This is a predictable response, one that I anticipated in my 2022 book, Nation of Victims, to anti-white discrimination over the last half-decade, and it is no longer just a fringe viewpoint. The alternative, and in my view, correct vision of American identity is based on ideals. Americanness isn't a scalar quantity that varies based on your ancestry. It's binary. Either you're an American or you're not. You are an American if you believe in the rule of law, in freedom of conscience and freedom of expression, in colorblind meritocracy, in the U.S. Constitution, in the American dream, and if you are a citizen who swears exclusive allegiance to your nation. As Ronald Reagan quipped, you can go to live in France, but you can't become a Frenchman. But anyone from any corner of the world can come to live in the United States and become an American. No matter your ancestry, if you wait your turn and obtain citizenship, you are every bit as American as a Mayflower descendant as long as you subscribe to this creed of the American founding and the culture that was born of it. This is what makes American exceptionalism possible. The divide between these two views is more foundational than policy divides between Republicans and Democrats. Older Republicans who may doubt the rising prevalence of the blood and soil view should think again. My social media feeds are littered with hundreds of slurs, most from accounts that I don't recognize, about Pajits and street shitters, and calls to deport me back to India. I was born and raised in Cincinnati and have never resided outside the US. Anti-Semitic statements are now normalized online, and it's not limited to the internet either. Rod Dreher, a conservative writer, recently described a trip to Washington, D.C., where he estimated that a sizable minority of Republican Gen Z staffers are fans of Nick Fuentes. This new online right movement doesn't represent the views of most real-world Republican voters. Take it from a son of Indian immigrants who dominates polling in Ohio's GOP primary for governor. But as one of the most vocal opponents of left-wing identity politics, I now see real reluctance from my former anti-woke peers to criticize the new identity politics on the right. This pattern eerily mirrors the hesitance of prominent Democrats to criticize woke excess in the run-up to the 2024 presidential election, even though most Democratic voters clearly never believed that math is racist or that hard work and the written tradition are hallmarks of whiteness. That's a big part of why Kamala Harris lost in such spectacular fashion. If the post-Trump GOP makes the same mistake with our own identitarian fringe, we will meet a similar fate. Young people are often a leading indicator of where political winds are blowing, and the generational nature of the problem is remarkable. Many voters under 30 believe they will never be able to afford a home. They're often saddled with college debt, and absent dramatic policy interventions, Social Security will most likely be curtailed before they ever receive benefits. They're understandably bitter about it. The rising sense of economic insecurity conspires with pent-up psychosocial angst. Depression and anxiety are more prevalent among members of Gen Z than in prior American generations. In the absence of a shared national identity, they're turning to tribalism and victimhood instead. Corporism on the right, Zohran Mamdani-infused socialism on the left. So what's the solution? We need to imagine a new American dream that delivers economic empowerment while also filling the next generation's hunger for purpose and belonging. To achieve that vision, 4 conditions must be met. First, conservative leaders should condemn, without hedging, groyper transgressions. If, like Mr. Fuentes, you believe that Hitler was really fucking cool, or if you publicly call Usha Vance a Jeet, then you have no place in the conservative movement, period. The point isn't to clutch pearls, but to prevent the gradual legitimization of this un-American animus. This online edgelording reminds me of toddlers testing their parents' limits. The job of a real Republican leader is to set firm boundaries for young followers as a good father does for a transgressive son. That doesn't mean censorship, it means moral clarity instead of indulgence. On policy debates, the Overton window should remain broad. It should be acceptable on the right to criticize U.S. aid to Israel or immigrant visas, but is downright unacceptable to spew poison towards Jews, and Indians, or any other ethnic group. We must practice what we preach. My current Democrat opponent in Ohio is a Jewish woman, and while I criticize her policy record unsparingly, I will be her most vocal defender against anti-Semitic attacks from left to right. Second, reduce costs of living. States can deliver quick wins. Drive down home prices by eliminating local land use restrictions to increase housing supply. Reduce property tax burdens by making bloated local governments more efficient. Reduce electric bills by speeding up permitting timelines for new power plants and natural gas extraction. Democrats gave a mixed reception to Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's case for abundance, but if they shed the left-coded delivery of their ideas, a future GOP could easily welcome many of them. Third, create broad-based participation in wealth generation from stock market gains. In the AI era, it's conceivable to envision a future with stock market outperformance even in the face of stagnating wages and job losses. That is a formula for social unrest, and shared equity offers a practical solution. If every kid legally born in the United States receives an American birthright in the form of $10,000 invested in the S&P 500, Every young American would become a millionaire by age 60, assuming a modest 8% annual return, which falls below historical 5, 10, 20, and 40-year averages. That's the mathematical magic of compounding. The effect would be profound. Instead of lambasting millionaires, they would be on the way to becoming millionaires. Young Americans on the left and right alike would have shared skin in the game to root together for maximal economic growth, a chance to play on the same team again while weaning themselves off the federal welfare state. The recently enacted Trump accounts are an early positive step in this direction. If the program expands in the future, it could gradually replace certain other federal entitlements instead of simply adding to them. Fourth, provide America the shared national project we badly need. America has a greater purpose in the world than what we have embodied thus far in the 21st century. Americans of all stripes long to be reminded of it through a modern-day equivalent of the Apollo mission. Perhaps it's establishing a base on the moon to achieve nuclear fusion in a way that empowers the creation of artificial intelligence without negative externalities and constraints on Earth. Perhaps it's something else of similar scale and ambition. Such a project could serve as a much-needed catalyst to revive high-quality math and science education in America by elevating standards in public schools, expanding educational choice, and much more. The uplifting truth is that the solution to identity politics needn't be one camp defeating the other, but instead achieving together a national escape velocity to more promising terrain. When I read this essay, it definitely represents a more coherent, a more issue-driven, by issue I mean meat and potatoes, issues-driven view of governance than what we've seen a lot in politics. Increasingly, and you see this from J.D. Vance, you see this from a lot of like the Israel-obsessed people on the American right. You see it from the conspiracism of Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens. And then, of course, the outright, just very racially motivated views of Nick Fuentes, that the American right has long passed its unification on the fiscal conservatism that dominated for so many decades. They're not even particularly motivated by anti-communism or anti-socialism anymore. By the way, just yesterday, Donald Trump proposed capping credit card interest rates. Could you imagine a Republican saying that 10 years ago? The Republican Party increasingly is culture war brained, whereas Vivek kind of embodies some of that old republicanism that's more focused on the economic governance and ensuring some long-term growth and preventing, of course, anti-capitalist behaviors by trying, as he said, trying to get people invested in the success of America through stock investment. And for however much I might disagree with Vivek on one issue or another, and there's plenty, I really respect the fact that he is actually dedicated to governance. When we talk about the threats of a populist insurgency, one of the problems that we had with Trump going into politics, and what I'm sure a lot of Republicans who are now a little bit more, who have been kind of exiled from the party, one of the issues that they've seen is that when you introduce a brand of insurgent populism that touts itself as the real Americans, the real Republicans, or the real defenders of the Western of the Western society, and they run on this kind of very zero-sum, grievance-based populism that views an in-group, a virtuous in-group, or an in-group that must be defended versus hostile out-groups. You have a style of politics that is increasingly grievance-based, and that doesn't subscribe to a framework that represents what the world actually is. The heavy racialized version of the heavy racialized, heavy conspiratorial, heavily hostile form of politics that we see in the Republican Party nowadays, Vivek blames it on backlash to woke excess of the 2020 era. And I'm sure you can maybe make a conceivable argument that might be some of the roots of it, but a lot of it ultimately stems from that zero-sum mindset that Trump introduced into politics when he got onto the scene in 2015. Trump, when he got into this scene, he immediately said, our country must be defended against hostile immigrants. The Mexican immigrants that come here, he called some of them rapists, criminals, and some of them may be good people. He decried how immigrants simultaneously steal jobs while also mooching off of welfare. When he talked about trade, he talked about how other countries are ripping us off, which is a big departure from the more traditional the more traditional neoliberal view of trade as mutually beneficial. And that's the actual correct interpretation of trade, as a mutually beneficial transaction that allows countries to specialize in what they are good at. But no, he wiped that away and said, no, NAFTA and the TPP, it's other countries ripping us off. And then you see the way that he views international alliances, the way that he approaches Canada, Mexico, much of the EU. Instead of trying to create a more coherent, a more amicable relationship that recognizes the importance of shared unity of Western countries in fighting against hostile enemies such as Iran or China, he started fighting with them. He started fighting with them, and right now our relationship with Canada and Mexico is borderline. It's quite damaged. I don't know if I would say that it can be repaired in not for a while. And then our relationship with Germany and France, it's not very good. And the reason why he's so hostile is because he views international alliances as ripping us off. And if you want to say that other countries should up their defense spending, I think that's one different argument from saying that other countries are either grifting or just showing a level of aggressiveness that is completely unprecedented. Obama and many other presidents were pretty open about pressuring other countries to increase their defense spending, but they never did it with such a hostility that they're willing to place tariffs on them or break relationships or outright insulting their leaders or shitting on them at international conferences or even or allowing their presence of NATO to be called into question or talking about taking Greenland. It's an unprecedentedly hostile view of international alliances that degrades the mutually beneficial nature of them in creating harmony, economic relationships, and creating stability on the world stage. So why are we talking about this? First of all, when we're navigating intra-party conflict, it's important to really stamp down on values at which you place yourself, which your party is built on. Hopefully, there are values that are represented, that can be reflected in positive governance, and there are values that represent reality. The old Republican Party, even if you may disagree with them, they did have an intellectual foundation and a reality-rooted foundation in the type of fiscal conservatism and even kind of like the Bible thumping, which I might not vibe with, but something that kind of sounded a little bit more coherent. And now increasingly, ever since Trumpism came along, the Republican Party's identity has become, first of all, whatever Trump wants to do, who's not particularly ideological, who's not particularly coherent. In fact, he's unprecedentedly coherent. And that's reverberated downstream in the form of conspiracism, racial identity, and just overall degradation of any form of intellectualism in the Republican Party. I worry that that's going to happen on the Democratic Party as well. The Democratic Party is becoming kind of populist in a way that I'm not sure is rooted in effective governance. Here in Chicago, we've had a ton of difficulty in navigating budgets because for whatever reason, Chicago and many other cities just do not philosophically believe in the idea of a spending cut. Chicago had a large increase in its city budget in 2020 because it had an infusion of cash as part of the COVID stimulus bills. But these were one-time dollars, and they used those one-time dollars on recurring expenses like education, pensions, healthcare. And now that those one-time dollars are lost, now they're having budget shortfalls. What they should do is just cut spending and then go back to where they were pre-pandemic, but they're not. And so now, because of like an increasingly rich versus poor class warfare economic culture in the Democratic Party, they're trying to make up for it by doing increasingly unorthodox taxes. Brandon Johnson is trying to do a mansion tax. He also tried to do, and then most recently he tried to do a head tax, which is a fee on each employee of a business. Now somebody would tell you, if you levy a head tax on your businesses, you're going to make your businesses less competitive. It's going to make it way harder for businesses to succeed in Chicago, and therefore they might just take their business and go to Miami or go to Texas. And that type of hostility towards the private sector is actually what is causing firms like Citadel and other finance firms to leave Chicago. And that's bad because those finance jobs are what's paying the bills. Okay, those finance jobs are paying the city taxes, and they're helping run the city. And now they're leaving. Now they don't pay anything. One thing I'm really worried about, and you're going to see this in a lot of my videos going forward, and I hope it's not interpreted in a mean way, because it absolutely isn't. One thing I'm worried about is that a lot of democratic governance is becoming increasingly diverging from any level of fiscal responsibility. There's a ton of fiscal mismanagement on the city and state level, particularly here in Illinois. They don't really they don't really believe in spending cuts. And so when they have budget shortfalls, instead of just cutting spending, they pursue increasingly unorthodox taxes. And they use the rich, because demonization of the rich and corporations and all of that is such a central part of democratic economic orthodoxy at this point. They're willing to do things like levy wealth taxes or head taxes, or just mansion taxes, or just things that aren't sound tax policy, because they just don't want to cut taxes. Or they just don't want to cut spending. You look at California, they've already driven Sergey Brin, Larry Page, and like 4 other billionaires out, and there's 20 more of them that are thinking about doing it, because they're planning of doing a quote unquote one-time 5% wealth tax. And what they should be doing, because California has hundreds of billions of dollar budgets, what California really should be doing is just cutting their spending. But they won't do it, and so when they encounter a budget shortfall, they're willing to do these type of things, and it degrades the competitiveness of their private sector and their businesses. They're just outwardly hostile, and they're just diverging from any level of responsibility. One thing that I really want the Democratic Party to adopt heading into not just 2026, but more importantly, the 2028 election cycle, I really want them to have some level of a responsible economic vision. They need to have a responsible economic vision. and they need to be able to fight back against some of the populist insurgencies that are just devoid from any level of rooted, grounded, real world governance. A type of governance that's not going to stunt economic growth by attacking the private sector constantly. A vision that's more in line with the more market-oriented form of governance that we saw from Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. In the same way, I started this video talking about Vivek Ramaswamy. In the same way that Vivek Ramaswamy is posting this essay, fighting against what he sees as an increasingly racially based form of resentment politics that is rising in the Republican Party, and he wants to fight back and go back to more grounded principles, more grounded governance. I really hope that the Democratic Party, as we head into the 2028 election cycle, is willing to fight back against a brand of economic governance that is not responsible and not stable. So that is a large reason for why I'm doing this. I do this with love. I do this with even respect for people who are left-wing populists. I know that they're well-intentioned, but it's not sufficient to be well-intentioned. You must represent some kind of framework of governance that is sustainable, and that's going to increase the size of the pie. That's going to lead to economic growth and something that we can all be proud of. So those are my thoughts for today. I look forward to expanding on them as we go into the future, and I certainly hope that the Democratic Party can live up to the potential that I believe that it can. So that's going to do it for me, and I'll see you guys in the next video.